Experts analyzed this 1865 portrait, but the slave's eyes told a brutal story. Dr. James Chen adjusted the resolution on his monitor for the third time, certain his eyes were deceiving him. The photograph before him was part of a massive digitization project at the Library of Congress. Thousands of Civil War-era images being scanned at unprecedented resolution, creating files so detailed that researchers could examine individual threads in clothing, read text on distant signs, and see details invisible to the original viewers. This particular image had been cataloged simply as Waverly Family Portrait, Virginia, 1865. It showed a prosperous-looking family arranged in their parlor, a middle-aged couple, 3 adult children, and 2 younger ones. The room spoke of wealth that had somehow survived the war. Expensive furniture, elaborate wallpaper, a chandelier glinting in natural light from tall windows. At the edge of the frame stood a young black woman, approximately 20 years old, holding a silver tea service. Her posture was rigid, her face carefully composed into an expression of neutral attentiveness. She wore a simple dark dress with a white collar, the typical uniform of a house servant in that era. James had been examining Civil War photographs for 6 years as part of his doctoral research at Georgetown University, focusing on how formerly enslaved people were depicted in images taken during and immediately after the conflict. Most photographs from this period showed black individuals at the margins, literally and figuratively, present but not acknowledged, seen but not truly visible. But something about this woman's eyes caught his attention. Even in the original scan, there was an intensity to her gaze that seemed unusual. She wasn't looking at the camera like the white family members. Her eyes were fixed on something off to the right, outside the frame, with an expression that James couldn't quite interpret. He opened the image processing software and began zooming in on her face. The new ultra-high-resolution scans captured extraordinary detail. As he magnified her eyes, focusing on the pupils and the reflective surface of her corneas, James felt his breath catch. There was something there, a reflection captured in the mirror of her eyes, preserved by photographic chemistry, and now revealed by modern technology. He increased magnification further, adjusted contrast and sharpness, and felt his hands begin to tremble. The reflection showed figures in the garden behind her, multiple people engaged in physical labor, and what appeared to be bodies. James spent the next 4 hours isolating and enhancing the reflection in the woman's eyes. The process was painstaking. The image was tiny, perhaps 50 pixels across in the original scan, and required sophisticated algorithms to clarify without introducing artificial details. What emerged made him feel physically ill. The reflection showed at least 3 men digging in the garden visible through the window behind the photographer. 2 appeared to be white, based on their clothing and posture. Between them lay what were unmistakably human forms, at least 4 bodies, possibly more, wrapped in what looked like canvas or rough cloth. The scene was being captured because of the long exposure time required for 1865 photography. The woman had stood perfectly still for 30 to 40 seconds, her eyes fixed on the window, watching something that the photographer either hadn't noticed or had chosen to ignore. And in those seconds, the light reflecting off the garden scene had entered her eyes and been recorded by the camera's lens. James checked the photograph's metadata. It had been taken on April 15, 1865, the day Abraham Lincoln died from his assassination wound. The same day the nation learned that slavery had truly ended. The same day that, theoretically, every enslaved person in America became legally free. Yet here was evidence that something terrible had happened at the Waverly estate on that very day. He called his dissertation advisor, Dr. Patricia Morrison, a leading expert on Civil War photography and post-emancipation violence. She arrived at his office within an hour, her usual composed demeanor giving way to shock as she studied the enhanced images. "This is extraordinary and deeply disturbing," she whispered. "The bodies, they appear to be black individuals based on the wrapped forms and the context. And this is happening literally as emancipation is being finalized. Could this be a burial?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. "Look at how quickly they're working," Patricia interrupted, pointing to the postures of the men digging. "This isn't a respectful burial. This is disposal. And look here." She indicated a detail James had missed. One of the wrapped forms appeared to be moving slightly, creating a blur in the photograph. Some of these people might still have been alive. James felt nauseous. We need to identify this location, find out what happened here. Patricia nodded grimly. And we need to identify her. She witnessed this. Her eyes preserved it. We owe her the truth. The photograph's original documentation provided limited information. Waverly Estate, Loudoun County, Virginia. Donated 1923 by Waverly family descendants. But this was enough for James and Patricia to begin their investigation. Loudoun County records showed that Waverly Estate had been a substantial property, 1,200 acres worked by approximately 40 enslaved people before the Civil War. The owners were Nathaniel and Catherine Waverly, who had 3 sons and 2 daughters, matching the family composition in the photograph. Nathaniel Waverly had served briefly in the Confederate Army but returned home in 1863 due to illness. The estate still existed, though much reduced in size. It had been converted into a vineyard in the 1980s and was now a popular destination for wine tours. James contacted the current owners, the Patterson family, explaining that he was researching a Civil War photograph taken on the property. Margaret Patterson, who managed the vineyard with her husband, invited them to visit. 2 days later, James and Patricia drove to Loudoun County. The Waverly house stood on a slight hill, a white columned structure that had clearly once been grand, but now showed its age despite careful maintenance. Margaret met them on the porch, leading them inside. I pulled out everything we have on the Waverly family. Honestly, there isn't much. The family left Virginia in the 1870s, financial troubles after the war. She showed them to a small room that served as an informal museum. Glass cases displayed Civil War-era artifacts and photographs. Among them was an original copy of the same portrait James had been studying. "Can you show us the garden?" James asked, pointing to the background of the photograph where tall windows looked out onto manicured grounds. Margaret's expression shifted, becoming uncertain. "The garden? Well, yes, but there's something you should know. When we were installing the vineyard irrigation system in 1985, the workers found something. Remains. Human remains." James and Patricia exchanged sharp glances. "We called the authorities, of course." Margaret continued. "They excavated carefully, found 6 individuals buried in unmarked graves. The forensic analysis dated them to the 1860s. The assumption was that they were enslaved people who died and been buried on the property." James pulled out his laptop and showed Margaret the enhanced image of the reflection. "We believe this photograph captured something significant happening in that garden on April 15, 1865. Margaret studied the image, her face growing pale. "You're saying the Waverlys murdered these people?" James and Patricia spent the following week at the Loudoun County Archives, searching for any documentation related to the 1985 discovery of remains at Waverly Estate. The investigation had been conducted by the county medical examiner and the state archaeology office, but the records were scattered and incomplete. What they found was both revealing and frustrating. The forensic report provided clinical details. 6 individuals, 4 adult males, 1 adult female, and 1 child approximately 10 years old. All showed signs of malnutrition and healed bone fractures consistent with hard physical labor, evidence of lives lived in slavery. But the cause of death section made James's blood run cold. All 6 individuals show evidence of trauma consistent with violent death. Subject 1, skull fracture. Subject 2, multiple broken ribs and evidence of stabbing. Subject 3, blunt force trauma to the head. Subject 4, broken neck. Subject 5, possible suffocation or strangulation. Subject 6, child. Cause of death unclear, possibly smothering or burial while still alive based on soil particles in airways. The report concluded, given the historical context and the location on a former plantation, these deaths likely occurred during the chaotic final days of the Civil War. Without additional evidence, it is impossible to determine if these were murders, executions, or casualties of violence common during that period. They knew, Patricia said quietly. The forensic team knew these people were murdered, but without witnesses, without documentation, they filed it away as historical tragedy. They contacted Dr. Helen Torres, the state archaeologist who had supervised the 1985 excavation. Now retired and living in Richmond, she agreed to meet with them and share her memories of the case. "I've thought about those remains for 40 years, Dr. Torres said. "The violence was unmistakable. These people were killed, probably over a short period of time, hours, maybe a day or 2, and they were buried quickly, without ceremony, hidden." She pulled out her own files from the excavation. "What haunted me most was the child, 10 years old, small for his age. probably due to malnutrition. His position suggested he'd been conscious when placed in the grave. He'd tried to fight his way out. James showed her the photograph and the enhanced reflection. Dr. Torres studied it in silence, her hands trembling. That's the witness, the one who survived to tell the story, except no one listened. Finding the young woman's identity became James's obsession. Somewhere in the fragmentary records of the Freedmen's Bureau, the chaos of post-war registration, or the scattered documentation of formerly enslaved people, her name had to exist. He started with a June 1865 Freedmen's Bureau report that Dr. Torres had found. It listed missing individuals from Waverly Estate by first name only: Moses, Samuel, Hannah, Elijah, Rachel, Thomas, child, age approximately 10, and Celia. 7 names for 7 people the family claimed had disappeared. 6 bodies had been found. Which name belonged to the survivor? The photograph provided clues. The young woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s. The Bureau report listed 2 women, Hannah and Celia. James needed to determine which one had lived long enough to be photographed in April 1865. He searched through Freedmen's Bureau registration records for Loudoun County and surrounding areas. In the Leesburg office records, dated July 1865, he found it. Celia Waverly, age 19, formerly enslaved at Waverly Estate, registered as free citizen, currently employed as domestic worker for Patterson family in Leesburg. Reports witnessing violence against fellow enslaved people at Waverly Estate, April 1865. Claims murders committed by Waverly family members. Investigation pending. James's hands shook as he photographed the document. Celia had survived. She had escaped. She had reported the murders. But the notation, investigation pending, was the last mention of the case. Patricia helped him search through local newspaper archives from summer 1865. They found a brief article. Accusations dismissed. Former slaves' claims of murder at prominent local estate found to be without merit. Investigation concluded that missing individuals likely fled property or succumbed to disease. No charges filed. They covered it up, James said bitterly. She told them exactly what happened, and they chose not to believe her. But Celia's story didn't end there. James traced her through census records, marriage licenses, and city directories. In 1866, she married Jacob Freeman, a Union Army veteran, and they moved to Philadelphia. The trail continued through decades. Celia Freeman died in 1912 in Philadelphia, age 66, survived by 4 children and 9 grandchildren. James found one more crucial document, an interview conducted in 1895 by a researcher documenting formerly enslaved people's testimonies. Celia had shared her story, a harrowing account of hiding while her friends were murdered, listening to them dig, burying people she loved. James and Patricia knew they needed to understand not just what happened, but why. Why would the Waverly family commit mass murder on the very day emancipation became final? What could enslaved people have known too much about that would drive their enslavers to such desperate violence? The answer lay in documents James found in the National Archives, Confederate Treasury records and correspondence from Virginia planters during the war's final months. As the Confederacy collapsed, many wealthy families had engaged in desperate attempts to hide assets, convert property to gold and silver, and secure wealth before Union forces could confiscate it. Nathaniel Waverly's name appeared in several suspicious transactions. In March 1865, he'd sold agricultural equipment and livestock for $15,000 in gold, an enormous sum that suggested the transaction involved more than farm tools. In April, just days before Lee's surrender, he'd transferred title of several properties to relatives in Maryland, attempting to shield them from Union seizure. But the most damning evidence came from a letter James discovered in the papers of a Confederate quartermaster. Dated January 1865, it referenced Nathaniel Waverly's special services in securing and protecting sensitive materials during the Army's retreat from the Shenandoah Valley. Patricia connected this to testimony from Celia's 1895 interview. She had mentioned seeing Confederate officers visit the estate in early 1865 and watching the Waverly sons bury heavy boxes in the garden at night. "We weren't supposed to see, but house servants see everything," Celia had said. "We knew they were hiding something valuable. Money or gold, we thought. We never spoke of it because speaking could get you killed, but they knew we'd seen. And when freedom came, we became witnesses who couldn't be controlled anymore." The Waverleys had hidden Confederate assets, probably stolen treasury gold or funds looted from occupied areas, on their property. The enslaved people who worked closest to the family had witnessed these activities. Once emancipation freed them, they could testify, could lead Union authorities to the hidden wealth, could expose the family's treasonous activities. So the Waverleys had chosen murder. On April 15, 1865, while the nation mourned Lincoln, Nathaniel Waverly and his sons had systematically executed 7 individuals who could testify against them. 6 died. Celia survived by chance and courage. The photograph takes on new meaning now, Patricia said. This was taken hours before the murders. Look at the family's expressions. There's tension there, barely concealed anxiety. James and Patricia knew they'd uncovered evidence of mass murder, but the perpetrators were long dead. Justice in any conventional sense was impossible, yet they felt an obligation to do something, to ensure Celia's testimony, preserved accidentally in her reflected gaze, finally received the hearing it had been denied in 1865. They compiled a comprehensive report documenting everything they'd discovered, the enhanced photograph showing the burial scene, the forensic evidence from 1985, Celia's Freedmen's Bureau report and 1895 testimony, the financial records suggesting Confederate asset concealment, and the timeline that connected all these elements. Their first step was contacting the Loudoun County Historical Society. The Society's director, Thomas Henderson, was initially skeptical when James called requesting a meeting to discuss new evidence related to Civil War-era crimes at Waverly Estate. But when James and Patricia presented their findings, Henderson's skepticism transformed into shock and then determination. "This is extraordinary and horrifying," he said, studying the enhanced photograph. "The Waverly family has been treated as respectable local history. There's even a Waverly Street in Leesburg. We have an obligation to tell the truth about what happened." The Historical Society agreed to mount an exhibition titled "The Testimony in Her Eyes, Justice Delayed for the Waverly Seven." The centerpiece would be the photograph, with detailed panels explaining Celia's story and the murders she'd witnessed. But James wanted to do more. He contacted the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, which documented racial violence and worked to memorialize victims of lynching and racial terror. While the Waverly murders didn't fit the traditional definition of lynching, they represented the same dynamic: white violence against black people designed to maintain power and avoid accountability. The EJI agreed to include the Waverly Seven in their documentation of post-emancipation violence. "These murders represent a pattern we've seen repeatedly," explained Sarah Mitchell, an EJI researcher. "As slavery ended, many enslavers chose violence against formerly enslaved people rather than accept their loss of power. Thousands of people were murdered in the immediate post-war period, and most cases were never prosecuted. Your research helps document this history." James also reached out to Celia Freeman's descendants. Through genealogy databases and historical records, he'd traced her family line to present day. Her great-great-granddaughter, Angela Freeman Davis, lived in Philadelphia and taught African American history at Temple University. When James contacted her, explaining what he'd discovered, there was a long silence on the phone. Angela Freeman Davis arrived in Washington 3 days after James's phone call. She was a woman in her 50s, with Celia's same intense eyes and determined expression. When James showed her the enhanced photograph, she stared at it for a long time, tears streaming down her face. "I grew up hearing stories about great-great-grandma Celia," Angela said quietly. "My grandmother would tell us that Celia had witnessed terrible things during slavery, that she'd tried to get justice, but no one would listen. But the stories were vague, just fragments passed down through generations. We never had proof. We never had her actual testimony preserved." James explained the entire investigation, from the initial discovery of the reflection, to the forensic evidence, to Celia's own words in the 1895 interview. Angela listened, occasionally wiping her eyes, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "She carried this her whole life," Angela said finally, "knowing what happened, knowing she'd reported it, knowing no one cared enough to do anything. That must have been unbearable." Patricia pulled out copies of additional documents they'd found, records showing that Celia had been active in her Philadelphia church, had helped establish a school for black children, and had worked with early civil rights organizations. "She didn't let it destroy her," Patricia said gently. "She channeled her pain into helping others, into building community, into fighting for justice in ways that were available to her." Angela nodded. That sounds like the woman my grandmother described. Strong, determined, never bitter, but never forgetting either. James showed her one final document, a letter Celia had written in 1910, 2 years before her death, to a researcher studying post-emancipation violence. In careful, educated handwriting, Celia had written, "I survived because God had a purpose for me. I could not save my friends, Moses, Samuel, Hannah, Elijah, Rachel, and young Thomas. I could not make the authorities punish those who murdered them, but I could live. I could testify. I could ensure that their names, at least, were remembered by my children and grandchildren. Perhaps someday, when America is ready to face its true history, someone will listen. Someone will care. Someone will give my friends the justice they were denied." "She was right," Angela whispered. Someone finally listened. Someone finally cared. She looked at James and Patricia with gratitude and grief mingled in her expression. "Thank you for giving Celia her voice back. Thank you for proving she was telling the truth." Over the following weeks, Angela worked with James and Patricia to prepare for the Historical Society exhibition. She brought family photographs, documents, and stories that added texture and humanity to Celia's life beyond the single moment captured in that 1865 portrait. The exhibition opened on April 15, 2024, exactly 159 years after the murders at Waverly Estate. The Loudoun County Historical Society's gallery was packed with visitors, historians, journalists, descendants of enslaved people, and local residents confronting a hidden chapter of their community's history. The centerpiece was the restored photograph, displayed on a large screen with the ability to zoom in and see the reflection in Celia's eyes. Next to it hung panels explaining the investigation, the forensic evidence, Celia's testimony, and the historical context of post-emancipation violence. But the most powerful element was a memorial wall listing the names of the Waverly Seven: Moses, age 38, Samuel, age 42, Hannah, age 31, Elijah, age 35, Rachel, age 28, Thomas, age 10, and Celia, age 19, survivor and witness. Each name was accompanied by whatever biographical information James had been able to uncover from plantation records and Celia's testimony. Moses had been a skilled blacksmith, Samuel had been a field supervisor, Hannah had been a cook, Elijah had worked in the stables, Rachel had been a seamstress, Thomas had been Moses' son, learning his father's trade, and Celia had been a house servant, forced to witness the murders of people who were her family in every way that mattered. Angela Freeman Davis spoke at the opening ceremony, her voice strong despite the emotion in her eyes. "My great-great-grandmother Celia lived 67 years after the murders at Waverly Estate. She built a life, raised a family, and fought for justice in her community. But she never forgot what happened on April 15, 1865. She carried those names, Moses, Samuel, Hannah, Elijah, Rachel, Thomas, with her always, and she passed them down to us, her descendants, with the instruction to remember. Today we honor her wish. Today we finally give the Waverly Seven the recognition and justice they were denied." The exhibition attracted national media attention. News outlets covered the story of the photograph and the reflection that had preserved evidence of mass murder for 159 years. The technological aspect, using ultra-high resolution scanning to reveal details invisible to the original viewers, fascinated people. But what resonated most deeply was Celia's story. A young woman who had witnessed horror, survived, reported the truth, was ignored, and then spent her life building meaning from trauma. Visitors stood before the photograph for long minutes, studying Celia's face, looking into her eyes, understanding that they were seeing through her perspective into a moment of profound violence. Many wept. Some left messages in the exhibition's guest book. "Thank you for telling this story. Celia's courage inspires me. We must never forget." The local community grappled with difficult questions. Should Waverly Street be renamed? Should there be a formal memorial at the actual burial site? How should schools teach this history? These conversations were uncomfortable but necessary, part of the ongoing process of confronting America's legacy of racial violence. 6 months after the exhibition opened, James stood in the Loudoun County Cemetery where the remains of the Waverly Seven had been reinterred after the 1985 discovery. What had been a small, neglected marker was now a proper memorial, a granite monument inscribed with the 7 names and the words, "Murdered April 15, 1865. witnessed by Celia, remembered always. Angela Freeman Davis stood beside him, along with several dozen other descendants of Celia's family who had traveled from across the country for the memorial dedication. The ceremony included prayers, songs, and testimonies about the importance of remembering hidden histories. Celia's eyes preserved what her voice could not make people hear, James said during his remarks. For 159 years, the evidence existed in that photograph, waiting for technology and will to converge. The reflection in her eyes was always there, through decades of the photograph being stored, ignored, damaged, and nearly destroyed. Through all that time, she was still witnessing, still testifying, still refusing to let their murders be erased from history. The investigation had led to additional discoveries. Margaret Patterson, the vineyard owner, had commissioned a thorough archaeological survey of the property. In addition to the 6 graves already known, researchers found evidence of the hidden Confederate assets, remnants of metal boxes buried in the garden, long since looted or removed, but leaving traces in the soil that confirmed Celia's testimony about what the Waverleys had been hiding. The Loudoun County government formally apologized for the 1865 investigation's failure to prosecute the murders. While the apology couldn't change the past, it acknowledged institutional complicity in allowing powerful white families to escape accountability for violence against black people. James completed his dissertation, which was published as a book titled The Testimony in Her Eyes: Technology, Memory, and Justice in Civil War America. It won several awards and became required reading in courses on Civil War history, African American studies, and digital humanities. But for James, the most meaningful outcome was simply that Celia's story was now known. School children in Loudoun County learned about her courage. Visitors to the Historical Society saw her photograph and understood what her eyes had witnessed. Researchers studying post-emancipation violence cited her testimony as evidence of patterns that had been systematically ignored. The photograph itself took on iconic status, reproduced in textbooks, displayed in museums, analyzed in academic papers. But it was never separated from Celia's story. Every reproduction included her name, her testimony, and the names of the 6 people whose murders she had witnessed. Angela Freeman Davis established a scholarship in Celia's name for students studying African American history. "My great-great-grandmother wanted the truth to be known," Angela said at the scholarship's launch. She wanted Moses, Samuel, Hannah, Elijah, Rachel, and Thomas to be remembered. This scholarship ensures that future generations will continue telling their story, will continue the work of uncovering hidden histories, will continue demanding justice even when it's been delayed for centuries. James often returned to that photograph in his continued research. Each time he found himself drawn to Celia's eyes, those dark eyes that had seen horror, that had captured evidence in their reflection, that had looked forward into an unknown future with determination to survive and testify. She had been 19 years old in that moment, just 19, standing in a room with the people who would soon murder her friends, watching through a window as graves were prepared, knowing something terrible was coming but not yet understanding its full scope. And she had survived. She had run. She had reported. She had lived a full life despite trauma, and she had left behind, without even knowing it, evidence that would eventually vindicate her testimony. The reflection in Celia's eyes had preserved truth across 159 years. It had outlasted the Waverly family's attempts at concealment, outlasted the 1865 investigation's whitewash, outlasted decades of willful forgetting. It had waited patiently for someone to look closely enough, to care deeply enough, to use technology and determination to reveal what had always been there. Celia had been a witness. Her eyes had testified when her voice was silenced, and now, finally, the world was listening.